Her shoulder hit the cinder-block wall, and the papers went everywhere. I was coming around the corner of the corridor at the exact wrong moment or the exact right one, depending on how you look at it. I saw the whole thing. Staff Sergeant Morrow had his forearm up and his weight forward, and the woman was pressed against the wall with her file folder on the floor and her papers fanning across the linoleum in every direction. She was small, maybe 5'4", in a plain khaki uniform with no rank device visible from where I stood, and she appeared to be in her early 60s. Morrow said, "Watch where you're going. This is a working corridor." She looked at him. Not up at him. She had her footing back and she was looking at him directly, without retreating from the wall and without any particular expression on her face. She said, "I apologize for the inconvenience." That was all she said. Morrow looked her over, the plain khaki, the age, the small frame, and said, "You shouldn't be in this section without an escort. Who signed you in?" She said, "I signed myself in." He said, "Ma'am, this is a restricted corridor. You need to be escorted at all times." She said, "I understand the policy," and bent down to pick up her papers. He did not help her. He stood there while she gathered them from the linoleum, and then he turned and walked the other direction. I walked over and helped her collect the last 3 sheets. I told her I was sorry, that Morrow had a certain way with people he did not recognize. She thanked me without particular warmth and said she had everything she needed from the floor. She had silver hair, cut short and practical. Her uniform was pressed correctly but carried no name tape that I could see, no ribbons, nothing that identified her unit or rank. She looked like an administrative visitor, someone's spouse perhaps, or a contractor in borrowed utilities. I do not say that to be unkind. I say it because that is the honest assessment I made standing there in the corridor, and because what happened in the next 45 minutes corrected that assessment completely and permanently. She gathered her folder, thanked me again briefly, and walked toward the main conference room at the end of the corridor. I went back to my station. 12 minutes later, I was passing the conference room on the way to the records office, and I heard a voice through the closed door. Level, clear, and steady, with the kind of cadence that does not rise to emphasize a point because it does not need to. The point lands at flat volume, and the listener knows it arrived. The voice was hers. I did not stop. It would not have been appropriate to linger. But I heard one phrase distinctly. The words "operational assessment of Kessler Station's northern perimeter," delivered in the same even tone as everything else, as if it were simply the next sentence in a sequence that had been proceeding for some time. 22 minutes after that, I was at my desk in the records office when Sergeant Major Cahill came in. Cahill had run the administrative section of Kessler Station for 11 years under 3 different commanding officers. He was not a dramatic man and he did not use dramatic language. He walked in, pulled the door closed behind him, and said, "Where is Staff Sergeant Morrow right now?" I told him Morrow had gone toward the motor pool. He said, "Get him back here." I said, "What has happened?" He looked at me and said, "The woman in the corridor this morning. Tell me what you saw." I told him all of it. The shove, the papers, what Morrow had said, what she had said, the way she had gathered her documents from the floor without asking for assistance or changing her expression. Cahill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her name is Rear Admiral Paige Selton. She is the incoming commanding officer of Kessler Station. She arrived this morning for her initial assessment visit, and she has been in the base commander's conference room for the last 20 minutes with Colonel Devane and the senior staff." I did not say anything. He said she filed no complaint. She did not mention the incident to Colonel Devane or to anyone on the senior staff. I found out because one of the AV technicians was setting up the conference room before the meeting and saw that some papers had been dropped in the corridor, and asked the front desk sergeant who the woman with the folder was. The sergeant told him. The technician came and told me because he had seen Morrow in that corridor this morning and knew Morrow's manner with visitors. I said she didn't report it. Cahill said no, she did not, and left to find Morrow. I want to be accurate about what happened next because there is a version of this story that is more dramatic than the truth, and I do not want to tell that version. There was no public scene. There was no shouting. There was no formation called, no public accounting in front of witnesses. What happened was this. Morrow was brought to the administrative office. Cahill closed the door. I was not in the room and I do not know precisely what was said inside it. What I know is that Morrow came out of that office 20 minutes later with the expression of a man who has just understood, possibly for the first time, that an action he considered minor has been fully accounted for, and that the accounting was now complete. I was in the corridor when the door opened. I had known Morrow for 14 months. I had never seen him look like that. He walked to the end of the corridor and stopped. He turned back. He said to me, I was the only one there, did you know who she was? I said I had not. He said, why didn't she say something? In the corridor, she could have just said something. I said I did not think she had needed to. He stood with that for a moment. He said, she just picked up her papers. I said yes. He nodded and walked toward the motor pool. Here is what I have understood about that morning in the time since. Admiral Selton arrived at Kessler Station ahead of her formal installation, without the escort and announcement that a flag officer's arrival would normally generate, and walked the corridors of her incoming command as an unknown. Whether this was deliberate assessment or simply a practical consequence of arriving early, I cannot say with certainty. But what she found in the corridor outside the records section was information immediate, specific, and reliable about how personnel at Kessler Station treated people they could not place in a hierarchy. She absorbed that information. She gathered her papers. She went to her meeting. She did not use the incident to confront or correct in the moment. She did not make it a scene. She did not raise her voice in the corridor or afterward in any discussion of what had occurred. The incident was processed through the appropriate command structure at a time and in a manner of the command's choosing, not hers. The consequences were proportionate to the action. The rank did the work. She never needed to invoke it directly. I worked at Kessler Station for another 18 months after Admiral Selton took formal command. What I observed was a commanding officer who ran a precise, demanding, well-organized station without volume or theater. Her standards were high. She communicated them once, clearly, and expected compliance, not because she was imposing in the room, but because the direction was right and the people under her command understood that quickly. She learned the name of every person on station within 60 days, not the senior staff, every person. Gate guards, maintenance crews, kitchen workers, the AV technician who had gone to Cahill with what he saw. She used names and she remembered context. In a command environment, this is not a small practice. It tells every person under your authority that they are seen, and seen specifically, not as a body filling a slot. Morrow was still on station when she took formal command. He attended the change of command ceremony with the rest of the base. I was standing near him. During the ceremony, she gave him the same direct, measured, professional acknowledgement she gave every other person in the formation. Not more, not less. Nothing that called attention to itself. The precision of that was not lost on him. I do not think it was unintentional. At the reception afterward, he found me near the coffee station and said quietly that he had considered requesting a transfer. I asked what he had decided. He said he had decided to stay and do the work. I said that was the right answer. He was quiet for a moment and then said, she never needed to make it a thing. She had every right to make it a thing and she chose not to, and somehow that is worse and better at the same time. I told him I understood what he meant. He said she picked up her papers. He went to report to his section. The rank was in the folder she had been carrying when her shoulder hit that wall. It was in the file she had studied before she walked through the door that morning. The operational assessment, the installation orders, the record that had preceded her to Kessler Station, whether anyone in that corridor had known it or not. The corridor did not know it. The corridor behaved accordingly. And then the corridor found out, through appropriate channels and in the appropriate sequence, without her ever needing to produce the file for effect. That is what command presence looks like before anyone knows who is in the room. Kessler Station runs differently now than it did before she arrived. The Northern Perimeter assessment she had been studying in that folder was implemented in her first 90 days. Administrative protocols that had grown soft were tightened without drama or complaint. Readiness ratings improved in the first evaluation cycle under her leadership and held through the following two. The change of command ceremony at the end of her tour drew attendance from 4 other senior officers who had requested to be present, which does not happen without reason. She left Kessler Station the same way she had arrived, quietly, ahead of the ceremony, with the work finished and no requirement that anyone make more of it than what it was. The corridor outside the records section has been repainted since then. There is no evidence of anything that occurred there, but I still think about it every time I walk through it, a woman with silver hair and a plain khaki uniform, gathering her papers off the linoleum floor, saying in a voice that carried no urgency and no grievance, "I understand the policy." She did. She understood every policy at Kessler Station, and she had studied them in that folder before she ever came through the door. When the door failed to behave as it should, she noted it, collected what she had dropped, and went to her meeting. That is the whole of it. It happened in approximately 4 seconds, and it has taken me years to understand everything that was in those 4 seconds. There is one more thing I should say. About 3 months after Admiral Selton took command, I was assigned to a working group she ran on base communications protocols. There were 8 of us in the room, ranging from a junior specialist to a lieutenant colonel. She ran the meeting herself, no aide taking notes for her, no deference to the senior officer present when she had a different read on a problem. She listened to each person completely before she responded. She did not interrupt, and she did not talk over anyone. At one point I offered an assessment I thought was solid work, and she heard all of it and then said, precisely and without apology, where the analysis had a gap and what question it left unanswered. She was right. The gap was real and the question was exactly the right one. I did not feel corrected. I felt that I was in a room with someone who cared whether the work was sound and was capable of identifying when it was not. That is not a universal experience in a working group, and it is worth naming. After the meeting, I stayed to collect some documents, and she was the last one still in the conference room. She had a pen out and was annotating her own briefing packet, and without looking up she said, "Good contribution today." The first 2 points were solid. I thanked her. She said, "Find the gap before next time and it will be stronger." She picked up her packet and left. That was the entire exchange. I thought about the corridor again. The papers on the floor, the plain khaki uniform, the woman who said, "I understand the policy," without any detectable bitterness, and then walked into a meeting where she briefed the senior staff on the condition of the command she was inheriting. The person in the corridor and the person in the conference room and the person in the working group were the same person, operating at the same level of precision at all 3 points. The corridor was simply where the measure of it was most visible, because the corridor was where the rank had been stripped away and only the person remained, and the person had responded with composure and gone back to work. That is what the rank means when it is carried correctly. Morrow is still at Kessler Station. He runs his section with more care than he did before. I have noticed this, and I believe it is connected. Some corrections are delivered in an office with a door closed, and some corrections are delivered in a hallway by the absence of anything that needed to be said, and the second kind tends to hold. The papers scattered across the linoleum that morning contained, among other things, the operational assessment that reshaped the northern perimeter of the station she now commands. I helped pick them up and handed them back without knowing what they were. That is the 4 seconds. That is everything that was in ITUP. I handed them to her without knowing what they were. That is the 4 seconds. That is everything that was in it.